Good afternoon. I'm Dan Kirshner. Most of you know me, Executive Director of the Northwest Gas Association. We're pleased to kick off 2022 with our January edition of the Northwest Gas Association's monthly webinar series. And we always really enjoy hearing from Grant Forsyth, Chief Economist at Avista Corp, who has a keen understanding of regional, national, and really global economics and how they drive each other. But Grant honed his acumen really in the Northwest. And so there's no better person to help us understand a little bit about what has gone on and what is going on. I'll leave it to him to vouch for his own veracity on what may go on in the future. But we're really pleased that Grant can join us, and we're pleased that you're here to join us for Grant's presentation. Just a couple of notes for today. First of all, you know that you're all muted on the webinar. Most of you, I see lots of familiar names. Most of you are veterans to our webinar series, so you know that we mute you all on the webinar. We also ask you to use the chat feature to ask your questions. I'd like to take this moment just to introduce the newest member of the Northwest Gas Association team, Natasha Jackson. So Natasha will be helping me today monitoring the chat, and you may hear her voice interrupt Grant at one point or another to ask questions that any of you pose in the webinar. So welcome to Natasha. If you want to know more about her, we're happy to share us, contact us after the webinar. The last thing is Grant has graciously agreed to both make his slides available to any who are interested, but also we record this session and then post it to our YouTube channel. It'll probably go up sometime this afternoon, maybe not until tomorrow morning, but it'll go up pretty quickly. And then we just want to draw your attention to our upcoming webinars. Hayden Ord from the Energy and Industry Decarbonization Branch of the BC Ministry of Energy, Mines and Low Carbon Innovation will be joining us to talk about BC's hydrogen strategy, which we think is really important to learn about. Those of you that may have some involvement either in gas supply or in policy know that hydrogen is the darling child of the day and hopefully of the future. Then in March 17th, we'll be having a conversation, we hope to have a conversation about energy policy and housing affordability. We've invited the Building Industry Association representatives from Oregon, Washington, and the National Home Builders to join us to provide their perspective on energy policies and housing affordability. So we hope you'll join us for those two webinars. With that, Grant, I'm going to stop sharing and turn the proceedings over to you. As I said, if you have questions, please use the chat function. Natasha and I will, as you pose a question, will interrupt Grant at that moment and ask your question of him. So Grant, thank you for being here as always. Welcome and take it away.
My pleasure, and hopefully everybody can hear me and see my screen. Let me just confirm that. Good, thank you. So what I'm going to talk about today is something I do just about every year at this time, is a US and Canada outlook. And we're going to be focused on 2022 and 2023. Now, as I told Dan at the beginning, this presentation can either be about 30 minutes, 40 minutes, or 3 to 4 hours, because of course, everything's in a complete state of chaos these days. But I'm going to try to keep it within that 30 to 40 minute range, at least trying to take into account human rights and so forth. So let's talk about my profession first, because as I also mentioned to Dan at the beginning, I will be eating a bit of crow today, but I'm used to big plates of crow, so it's not a problem. But I will say it's not a great time to be forecasting. And in particular, this was a quote that I found from a Washington Post article just recently. And the title of the article is, "Here's another thing the pandemic messed up, economic forecasts." And this quote comes from Erica Groshen. She's the former head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US, and she's currently an economic advisor at Cornell. And her quote in this article was, "Models are predicting what's normal in a world that isn't normal." And that is really a big problem right now. I think when the latest employment numbers for December for the US came out, I think there were hardly any forecasters in the US that were even close to that actual number. But we can also see that with inflation, which I admit that I had misjudged myself, like many economists. But also, we're going to talk about the fact that GDP this year, both in the US and Canada, and particularly the US, has also come in under expectations. So, as we discuss the forecast today, just keep in mind this quote: we're predicting what's normal in a world that isn't normal. So, if nothing else, maybe it provides a pointed discussion. So in terms of the outlook summary, hey, what are we going to be seeing today? Well, first thing, post-stimulus GDP growth is expected to moderate. In particular, we're seeing an end to both the fiscal and monetary stimulus, that extraordinary stimulus we saw at the beginning of the pandemic. That's coming to an end. So we should expect to see GDP growth moderate. Inflation not expected to reach a comfort zone until 2023. And I put in parentheses there, maybe, because one of the things we're seeing is kind of a growing difference between what forecasters think, and that's what I'm going to show you today, versus what household and business surveys are showing. And to give you an example, the Bank of Canada has released their most recent surveys of both consumers and businesses that they do. And pretty clearly, the surveys show people with much higher expectation of inflations than what professional forecasters are generating. In terms of the employment side of the economies, the good news is Canadian employment has actually fully recovered, both in Canada and in BC, but that is not the case for the US. Okay? Spend some time talking about that. National and regional employment growth is expected to be similar for the next 2 years. And so in other words, forecasters are looking at Canada being about the same as BC in terms of employment growth. And it's also the case that forecasters are seeing that maybe the US and US Pacific Northwest will be very similar in terms of employment growth. I also want to spend some time talking today about something that I think is really important. I've discussed this many times, and I actually think it's being under-discussed, especially in the United States. But in particular, what we saw from COVID was we saw a suppression of national population growth rates in 2021. But we're also seeing increasingly a long-run divergence between Canada and the US. In particular, the US is starting to show incredibly low population growth rates. The 2021 estimate for the census was 0.1%, which might as well be zero. It's probably the lowest population growth in US history. Also, long-term regional population growth will probably still be above national rates, and that's going to be due largely to people continuing to move to the region. So let's talk about inflation, which has created a great number of problems for everybody. And so what we show here is the average annual inflation for the decade up to the pandemic, then 2020, the year the pandemic started. The estimate for 2021, Canada is actually the actual number for the CPI this year, 3.3%. For the US, we're measuring inflation using the Personal Consumption Expenditure Index because that's the main index that the central bank uses in the US for conducting monetary policy. And in Canada, it's the CPI. And we can see very clearly it's elevated over the green line, which is that 2% target. And then what we see in the forecast, and this is an average across many different forecasters, okay? What we're seeing here is a general decline in inflation out to 2023. But, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty around these numbers, right? And for comparison, just so we understand this, the black bar is really the IMF's measure of global inflation and their forecast for 2022 and 2023. But the main points of here is that has inflation been transitory? Well, less than hoped. Okay? And quite frankly, the prospect of inflation reaching a comfort zone in 2023, I think we need to talk about the growing difference between forecasters and surveys of households and businesses. if you look at those surveys, they see inflation much higher, maybe a percentage point higher in 2023 than what professional forecasters are showing for the US and Canada. And so pretty clearly, we're seeing a divergence between households and professional forecasters. And I think it's just simply a warning that maybe inflation might be higher in 2023 than what the consensus view is right now. And that's just something to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is that at inflation at this pace, what we're seeing both in the US and Canada is wages are struggling to keep pace with this inflation, even though wages in fact are rising. They're just not rising quite as fast. Okay, and so let's talk about drivers. What's really behind this inflation? Well, it's really a mixture of labor shortages, supply chain disruptions, and in some regional areas, inflation is actually quite a bit higher than what the national numbers are because of shelter costs, in particular housing. And that's certainly going to be the case for places like Spokane, Coeur d'Alene, Vancouver, Seattle, and Portland. And so in some regions, the inflation situation is actually much worse than what the national numbers show because of those housing pressures. Now, the supply chain issue continues to be a problem. And to give you an example of how this continues to be a problem, Canada has instituted a new policy where truck drivers coming from the US need to have proof of vaccination. This is something that's going to continue to cause supply chain disruptions and keep inflation elevated. And it's these types of things that keep cropping up that are making it difficult for professional forecasters to get it right. So it's finally forced the hand of central banks. And so what we're going to see ultimately is the Fed, the Bank of Canada, and other central banks are moving to tighter monetary stances. They've all pretty much signaled they'll be moving in that direction. The Fed has clearly signaled 3 quarter-point rate increases in the federal funds rate this year and 3 in 2023. But here's the interesting part, and I think this is worth commenting on. If you look at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange on futures contracts for the federal funds rate, market is actually thinking the Fed will do 4 this year, not 3. And you've even heard some comments from central bank officials, in particular presidents of central banks in the regional banks in the US, are suggesting that 4 is maybe not impossible. Okay. Now, for Canada, they have not signaled as strongly as what the Fed has done, but based on history, the Bank of Canada will follow rate increases in the US. And so I would expect the Bank of Canada also be raising rates in 2022 and 2023. Canada has a particularly difficult situation when it comes to monetary policy because they also have to consider how changing rates in the US will affect exchange rates in Canada. So that kind of makes it that rates are going to be highly correlated between the two countries, especially their policy rates. Now, in the very long term, the good news is that long-term inflation expectations are somewhat elevated, but they have not become completely unanchored. That's important because if you start to see inflation expectations out beyond 5 years really become elevated, that is unanchored, that's a much, much bigger problem for monetary policy in countries like Canada and the US. So if we look at GDP growth, okay, again, we see that 10-year average before the pandemic. We see the pandemic growth in 2020. And then we see that estimate for 2021, and we have data through the third quarter. And so what it looks like this year is both the US and Canada will come in around 5% versus about 6% global growth. I would say that what's being produced this year in both Canada and the US is under what people expected 12 months ago. In particular in the US, the forecast 12 months ago was maybe 6.5%. But again, things like labor shortages, supply chain disruptions, these things have caused growth to actually come in under forecast. Again, it's that not normal world playing a role again. Okay, as we go forward, the forecast average for 2022 and 2023 is for a continual slowdown in GDP growth. That makes sense. In particular, you have, the end of fiscal stimulus, that's waning. You've got rising interest rates. And also, I think one of the things that makes some of these forecasts highly uncertain, especially in the case of the US, is, the US politically is still very messy. We've got midterm elections in 2022. The Republicans have a good chance of taking back one or both houses of Congress. And so we're getting into another period of policy uncertainty, right? So depending on how that goes, that could affect how businesses invest, how consumers spend, in particular in the US. But we also have a political environment just sort of globally that doesn't look very pleasant right now. We've got Russia and the Ukraine. We've got tensions with China and Taiwan, still tensions between China and a lot of different trade issues. This could all have impacts that actually reduce growth going forward. Now, for Canada, they're in a little bit better position. We've seen a recovery in oil prices, which will likely benefit growth in Canada. And also, as I think we get behind the pandemic a little bit more, meaning the pandemic begins to recede a bit, I think we'll see more of a trade recovery occur. And because of the importance of trade to Canada, I think that will put Canada in a better position going forward. So let's spend some time talking about national employment. And so it's interesting to look at this because what this shows is the level of employment indexed to February 2020. So that index level is 100, and that was the last really normal month before the pandemic hit. And so what I'm doing is showing you the level of employment relative to that February 2020 number for both Canada and the US up to December 2021, the most recent data that has been released. And the interesting thing here is what we can see is that Canada has actually fully recovered. They're actually about 1% above where they were in February 2020. Unfortunately, the US is still about 2% below. We're continuing to struggle, I think, again, with the waves of the virus, the supply disruptions, and so forth. And that has still left us about 2% below where we were in February 2020. And so in terms of the employment outlook, my view is see the previous slide, because all the things that are working for or against GDP are going to be working for and against employment, right? But in terms of the outlook, again, Canada had a very strong year, 4.6%. Looking for a pretty good year in 2022. The forecast average is just over 3, and then falling to that longer term level of about 1.4%. The expectation for the US, which again had that weaker 2021 versus Canada, is that things will pick up in 2022, that we'll get back to that pre-pandemic level this year. But once again, there's some uncertainty around this. If you follow forecast surveys like I do, for example, if you look at the Wall Street Journal survey of forecasters, the expectation for employment growth has been gradually coming down compared to, let's say, 6 to 12 months ago. And that's not surprising, since the employment numbers continue to quite often disappoint in the US. When we get to 2023, then we see a number kind of close to Canada, and that's the expectation that we're seeing a more normalized US and Canadian economies. Now, in terms of employment, one of the things I'd like to talk just briefly about is small employers. One of the things you're hearing a lot about in both the Canadian press and the US press is how small employers are really struggling with the labor shortages. You see a lot of smaller employers having to curtail hours. In addition, a lot of employers are struggling to meet the new higher wages. And so going forward, it'll be interesting to see how the small employers recover as the economy hopefully normalizes, because I think in both countries, they are important to producing long-term job growth, but they're definitely under a lot of pressure again with these waves of the virus. The other thing that's happening, I think it's useful just to briefly mention, is that in the US, there seems to be a bit of a union resurgence going on. In particular, you have union votes among Amazon centers. you have union votes among Starbucks locations in the US in certain states. Whether or not this is temporary or permanent, it'll be interesting to observe, because it's been a long time since the US has seen, I think, that much interest in unionization. If we look regionally, okay, and so what this graph is showing is exactly the same idea as the previous one. It's everything is indexed to February 2020, and we're looking at BC, that's in the red. I've grouped Washington, Idaho, and Oregon together. That's the US Pacific Northwest, that's the blue line. And then the black line for a comparison is California. And I always like to talk a little bit about California, or at least just have it in there, because certainly for the West, stretching all the way up into Canada, what happens in California is still meaningful. Okay, and again, when we talk about employment growth, it's important to realize what I said about national GDP, national employment. All those issues also apply at the regional level. Now, what's interesting is BC really put in a pretty strong year. They're now 2% above their pre-pandemic level. They had a very strong year, which is amazing when you consider that BC took a pretty good hit with the heat dome, and they took a really big hit with the flooding that has occurred towards the start of winter. They still put in 6.4%. The outlook for 2020 is 3%, which is still pretty good. And then again, what you see in that 2023 period is something closer to that long run value. Again, US Pacific Northwest, okay year, but not great. We're still about 2% below our pre-pandemic level. So the expectation is that we'll get good growth this year as we catch up. Again, we'll see. And then again, that growth rate falling back in 2023 to that longer term kind of normal growth behavior. Okay. Now, so what do these numbers mean? It means essentially, yes.
Grant, I have a question. There's not one in the chat. Just a reminder to folks, if you have questions for Grant, please enter them into the chat. So your forecast average for 2023, you indicate that's returning to normal. So what we're seeing is 1.5 to 2% is normal job employment growth in a normal economy.
Yes.
Okay.
And go back to my second slide of the quote.
Right.
You know, so I'm always, you know, that slide with the quote is the caveat on really, in particular, 2023, because, you know, again, a lot of these forecasters are using models, as I do, with historical data. And, you know, the models always, a lot of times, want to push you back to this long run normal. But the virus still has a lot to say about what that's going to look like. And so that 2023 number in particular, I think, probably has a lot of forecast variance around it. Does that answer your question, Dan?
Yes, sir. It sure does. Thanks, Grant.
Okay. So what these numbers regionally mean is that you know, BC and Canada are going to look very similar in terms of their forecasts in 2022 and 2023, and the US and US Pacific Northwest are also going to look pretty similar to each other over that 2-year horizon, 2022 and 2023, right? And so what we're seeing is that really regionally and nationally, we should look pretty similar, and you know, that remains to be seen. Leading up to the pandemic, both BC and the US Pacific Northwest were really outperforming their national comparison. But at least for now, the expectation is we'll sort of regionally and nationally look about the same. One thing about California, I will say the one thing about is problematic for the US. I've joked before that a lot of people, you know, don't like California. It makes them culturally and spiritually uncomfortable. But California is a major economic machine still. And part of the reason the US has not fully recovered is when you have big states like big states like California that have not fully recovered. And they're still, you know, 5 to 4% down from where they were pre-pandemic. And that's a big deal because of the size of that state. And so really, until you see the big states like California really recover, it's harder for the US as a whole to do it as well. So now, kind of, since we worked through the numbers, a couple things to think about in terms of future employment growth. In addition to kind of pandemic effects, if you follow the news about Washington and Idaho and Oregon, what you're seeing are really three states that are starting to move away from each other in terms of policies. In particular, the biggest differences between Idaho and then, Idaho versus Washington and Oregon. You're seeing very different policies on how, COVID is being handled, how taxes are going to be handled, how environmental policy is going to be handled, and that might start to see some differences in growth occurring because of different policies. I would also say, in terms of the current recovery, Idaho has definitely been the strongest. They're probably 3 to 4% above where they were pre-pandemic. They've grown very robustly because of their approach. They've had less of a lockdown approach. Washington is next, and probably still the weakest performer in terms of recovery has been Oregon. But again, going forward, the states seem to be diverging in terms of how they're going to be governed. And again, we just need to be mindful that could have some employment impacts going forward. The other thing the region seems to be burdened with, and they don't seem to be going away, are these extreme climate events. It's actually something I'm increasingly concerned about. The heat dome was incredibly disruptive. It was incredibly dangerous. There was, pretty serious events that occurred in Canada. A township burned down. And so, we're still dealing with these issues, and they also have employment impacts, and they're really hard to forecast as well. So before I go any further, does anybody have any questions?
We're not seeing any in the chat yet, Grant. So why don't you go a slide or two and we'll see if folks have some. Oh, wait, I got one right here.
Okay.
BC and California have started carbon cost programs. And of course, Washington State is not far behind. It needs to be implemented, and even Oregon is going to have a carbon constraint. How will the impact of proposed carbon costs in Oregon and Washington impact economic recovery? BC and California are on different recovery tracks?
That's a good question. The answer is I'm not sure. I mean, because some of this may raise costs to businesses, it may slow employment growth, right? I mean, that's sort of what I would say generally. The problem is we're still very new into these policies. And so pretty clearly, it's difficult to forecast until they're fully implemented. And so my initial response as an economist is it may slow employment growth in where these things are being implemented. But again, it's hard to predict exactly what that's going to look like until they're in full implementation phase and everybody's having to deal with the costs associated with those. So it's actually an unknown. And it's one of those things that drives forecasters crazy because, how do you build that in? Any other questions?
Maybe Grant, a follow on to that question is, so California's had its carbon program in place for a while. It's certainly more mature than BC's, although BC's had the carbon tax, and definitely more mature than Washington's, which the rules haven't even been developed around it yet. Have we seen any economic impact from any of those that have been in place for a little while?
With California, I have not seen anything. I would have to actually go and look at the research on this to see if, since California has been at this a bit longer, what have they been able to parse from the numbers have been the economic impact. And one of the things that's really hard about doing that is you almost have to build what we call in economics, a counterfactual model. You have to ask the question is, if these policies had never been in place, what would employment growth have looked like over the period where they are in place? And I'd have to look and see if there's been anything done on that.
Okay, thank you.
but it is very difficult to parse those things out. So I'll have to take a look and see. Now, the one thing I would also say, going back to that just a little bit, it'll be interesting to see, because even though that Washington and Oregon are kind of, I would say, generally moving in the same direction from a maybe policy point of view, environmental point of view, it is they're not exactly going to be the same. And so it'll be important to kind of pay, I think, attention to the differences as things develop. But I think in particular, I think the bigger differences you're going to see, and to emphasize this, is between Idaho and what Idaho is going to do, because they definitely have a much more laissez-faire approach on a lot of these issues. And I think, at least initially, it could give Idaho some advantages, in particular in recruiting businesses, because they're, again, probably going to have a very different policy stance than Washington or Idaho. And if you look at who's running for governor in Idaho, you have your choice between really pretty conservative in the form of Brad Little to essentially libertarian candidates running against him. So again, you just see really Idaho diverging from the rest of the West.
Maybe my question here is going to be premature, Grant, but I'm wondering if Avista has seen any of evidence of accelerated growth across the border, just because of things like, whether it's in housing, because of things like building codes, or even economic growth, business growth. Are you seeing a move or increased enthusiasm for the other side of the border there?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of our own service area, you clearly see much faster population growth on the Idaho side. There's just no doubt about it. In fact, it's it's above 2%, what we've seen the last 5 years in the Kootenai metro area. And some years, I think it even hit 3%. So, compared, which is, probably almost twice as fast as what it's been growing on the Spokane metro area, which is the Washington side. And virtually all of that growth, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, virtually all of that growth is due to in-migration. It's people moving to that region. And in fact, what we've seen over the last, in particular, 5 years, is you've seen a lot of people moving to Idaho. Some people argue it's because of political preference. I would argue that there are other factors at work too. But pretty clearly, Idaho has been growing very rapidly, much faster than what you're seeing in a lot of other Western states. And we certainly see it in our service territory. So since we talk about population growth, I just want to talk a little bit about national population growth, because I think what's happening between the US and Canada is really important. I also think what's happening regionally is really important. And so in the past, when I've talked about population growth, I always like to remind people that in the long run, GDP growth is going to be equal to labor productivity growth plus population growth. Now, right now, both in Canada and the US, labor productivity growth is probably in that 1% to 1.5% region. I mean, that's kind of what we think in the long run. That's what it seems to be growing at, 1 to 1.5%, right? But there's a bigger divergence occurring when you look at population growth. And so what this slide shows is Canadian and US population growth going back to the early 1970s. That dotted line is really a break point that's occurring. And so if you look from, the 1970s up to 2007, on average, Canadian population growth and US population growth was pretty similar. But then, really after the Great Recession, or at the start of the Great Recession, we really started to see this big divergence occur, where growth in Canada has actually been much stronger than the US, and the US has actually continued to really see declining population growth. And what you get then is, because of the pandemic, which suppressed growth both in Canada, and you can see that right at the last point on the graph, but it certainly suppressed it in the US, and the US already had declining rates. And the evidence is that COVID has really suppressed birth rates. Okay, so in other words, it suppressed growth in 2021 via higher death rates and lower births. And it also has kind of played havoc with global migration as well, which historically has been important to both Canada and the US. And so what we get out of this is this incredibly low population growth rate for the US, almost zero for 2021. And if you look regionally inside the US, only the West and South had positive growth. So the growth we did see in 2021 is really due just to the Western United States and the Southern US. Canada actually has a big advantage over us because they have really a more coherent immigration policy. It's less controversial. The United States immigration policy, as you know, remains unclear and extremely divisive. And it's unclear when that's going to change. Excuse me. So what that means is that in the long run, assuming we have relatively similar labor productivity growth, right? The lower population growth in the US, if that doesn't recover, it means GDP growth long run could be noticeably lower than what you see in Canada, right? And actually the Federal Reserve has been changing their long run outlook for US GDP growth for quite a while. After the Great Recession, it went from 3% to 2%, and it's now sub 2%. And I think that reflects to some extent this realization that US population growth has really fallen off, and it's unclear when it'll recover because, again, given family formation, the most important thing to growing population at this point is really immigration. And without it, you're essentially going to have to accept a much lower population growth rate nationally. And that means a lower GDP growth rate long term. And that has implications for how we pay for stuff. So it's just something to keep in mind as a much longer term problem. So let me stop. Any questions about that?
Hey Grant, sorry to interrupt. Just curious if you have a chart like this one for birth rate only.
I do not have it. I have looked at some birth rate graphs. So in other words, I've looked at some studies that have focused on birth rates, and actually they've done some studies because of the pandemic on what did the pandemic do to birth rates. And seems pretty clear, or the evidence suggests that in developed countries like the US and in Western Europe, the pandemic took already low birth rates and suppressed them further.
Thank you.
Yep. And generally speaking, if you look at a lot of the US, Western Europe, even in Canada, if you look at any kind of growth rates of family formation, birth rates, this kind of thing, most countries are getting pretty close to what we call sub-replacement level, meaning that births are so low that they're not enough to offset deaths. Okay? And so that means without in-migration or people coming to the country, you're almost certain to start to experience zero or negative population growth in the long run. So regional population growth, right? Again, just taking a look, it turns out that the pandemic probably suppressed growth rates regionally as well as nationally. And so we see Canada in 2020 and the US in 2020 in blue, and 2021 which is how the graph is ranked, right? So blue is 2020, red is 2021. And we start with Canada and the US, right? Those really low growth rates. The suppression occurred because of the pandemic, more than likely. But here we get back to this issue of Idaho, right? And you can see that really Idaho has continued to really power through the pandemic. I mean, and actually what's interesting, and I would have expected a suppression of population growth in 2020, But really the pandemic, the beginning of it, people were still moving around, still in migrating. And so really, even in 2020, you had surprisingly good population growth rates regionally, but again, driven largely by people moving to the region rather than babies being born. But Idaho is clearly the standout, and then followed by BC. And then we have Oregon and Washington. And actually, I probably didn't rank this right because Washington looks like it's should be a little bit ahead of Oregon there. And then for comparison, we can see really California, where you see really an out migration occurring, which has actually caused negative population growth on top of the suppression of births versus deaths relative to COVID. But in any case, really we did see kind of a push down of growth, especially in Oregon and Washington and California in 2021. And again, the evidence suggests that has a lot to do with the pandemic. And so going forward, I do expect regional population growth to be stronger than what we're seeing nationally. In other words, BC should continue to be somewhat stronger than Canada. And I expect regionally us to be noticeably stronger than the US, but that depends on, again, a return to in-migration, people moving to the region. Because if we're going to rely on organic family formation, the population growth regionally in the US is going to look a lot like it does for the US as a whole. Okay, now quickly about this, one of the things that we're still dealing with are rapid home prices. Again, I've talked about the fact that rapid growth in home prices regionally is one of the things that's exacerbating inflation on a regional basis. And so one of the things that's been driving a lot of the strong growth in home prices is people continue to move here. But rising interest rates should help cool that. But because I expect people to continue to move to the region, I don't expect home prices to essentially collapse like they did in the Great Recession, in part because when I talk to people in the banking sector that I know, the loan quality is actually continued to be very good through the expansion of the housing market. And so it's not the case that you have a lot of, excuse the expression, dodgy loans out there. And so again, rising rates will cool the market, but because of in-migration, I still expect home prices not to collapse. Okay, so that ends my talk. 38 minutes. I'm proud of myself. I kept it under 40. And so do we have any additional questions? And for my part, I'd be happy if anybody had answers.
Well, thank you, Grant. Just while we give you all a minute or two to type questions in for Grant, it sounds like my biggest takeaway, Grant, is we just don't know for sure. Things could be okay. We might be on a path to recovery, but there are a lot of dynamics at play that can affect that one way or the other. But one of the big things I heard from you is population growth is a clear problem.
Yeah, it's a clear problem. I mean, and I just think the U.S. political situation, I just don't see a resolution to our immigration issues happening in a bipartisan way. Maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. But again, for the U.S., as for a lot of countries in the developed world, and increasingly in the what I call middle income countries like China, is that family formations are at an all-time low, or continue to fall, which means organic growth doesn't get you much. And so that immigration, having a coherent, stable immigration policy is going to be pretty important.
I think the other thing I heard from your presentation today is there may be a bunch of us on this call who may be moving soon to Avista's service territory.
Well, and here's the funny thing about that, and I'll just wax a little bit about that. So it turns out, I've looked at who's moving to Kootenai County, which is the base for Coeur d'Alene, and who has been moving to Spokane County, which is, again, the Spokane metro area. And you can actually get a pretty good sense of that by looking at IRS data. So it turns out the IRS has data on changes of address of tax returns. And so you can track pretty well where people are coming from based on their tax returns. And it's really kind of neat data. And what I show for the region, the largest share of people moving here are actually moving here from some other place in Washington or some other place in Idaho. And so a lot of that migration that's occurring specific to our service territory are people either in Idaho or Washington changing locations to here. It's true that there is another big segment of that is California, both coming to Spokane and both coming to Coeur d'Alene or Kootenai County. But a lot of the movement that's occurring is actually within the states themselves.
And I do have another question here. Hopefully others are typing any questions, although you're always very thorough, Grant. So you leave little room for question. The question here is, what's the future job growth in the Pacific Northwest? Service, manufacturing, government, timber, agriculture. You break those out sometimes.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so really, I mean, the reality is both in Canada and the US, services are the dominant form of employment. And so really, it's probably accounts for roughly 70% of employment, both regionally in the US. It's probably similar in Canada as well. And it's been dominant for a long time. And the reality is if your service sector isn't growing, you're not going to generate enough employment growth in manufacturing or agriculture to give you much. It has to be happening in the service sector. And so really, that's where I expect a lot of growth to occur, in part because of technical innovation. Manufacturing and agriculture are great adopters of new technology. We continue to see them adopt a lot of technology, and the evidence suggests the technology they're adopting is largely labor replacing. I mean, that's what the academic evidence suggests. And that really started, you notice that kind of adjustment occurring starting maybe in the late 1980s based on the research that I've read. And so a lot of the investments that are being made seems to have a net reduction in employment. And so my guess is manufacturing, which tends to see a permanent drop in overall employment every time there's a recession. And from what I can read in the popular press, they're still continuing to add physical capital that essentially reduces their reliance on labor. And I think you essentially they move together with agriculture. And my guess is we're going to continue to see that employment level drop in ag because of those innovations. So it has to be in the service sector. I don't necessarily think government's going to be a big source of growth, maybe at the local level in some places in terms of education. But again, I think it's that private service sector that's going to be crucial to generating employment growth.
Okay, are there any other questions? If so, type them into the chat function there. We'll give it just a few seconds here. And while we're waiting to see if we get any additional questions, I will just pull up my reminder slide. And just to remind you folks that we have the BC Hydrogen Strategy scheduled for noon to 1 p.m. on February 17th. You can go to our website to sign up for that. And then March 17th, almost certainly we're going to have an energy policy and housing affordability webinar, which should also be terrifically interesting. Here's a question for you, a couple of them actually, Grant. One, with the migration to Idaho from the western states, do you foresee a political shift for Idaho? Now you're getting into political economics.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Actually, I've been trying to read about that too. And again, it's hard to get a good feeling for it. I mean, there's a lot of press being written about that, like the Idaho Statesman and so forth, the main newspaper in the Boise area. You do see a lot of stuff being written about that. It's hard to tell. I personally think that kind of in-migration will always change your politics because, well, first off, there is some evidence that you do have some migration to Idaho because it has that more conservative kind of small government approach, and people are attracted to that, and they're moving there because of that. But And a lot of those people, not a lot or significant number of those folks are probably coming from places like California. But, it turns out that their idea of conservatism may not be exactly the same as what's homegrown. And there's actually been some interesting articles in the press written about this, about that you would think in Idaho, you wouldn't have a very contentious election for governor, but you do, right? I mean, the upcoming election is really pretty contentious, and because what you have is a strong contention over how conservative should we be. And so pretty clearly, some of the people who have moved to Idaho don't necessarily share the vision of conservatism of older native-born individuals in the region.
Right. I like to characterize the gubernatorial race in Idaho as a contest between the right and the writer.
Yeah, and there was really a good, no, exactly, and there was really a pretty good piece. And again, I think it was the Idaho Statement that wrote this about, Governor Little, who is really, comes from a very, older, well-established Idaho family, and his conservatism reflects that background versus a lot of people who have migrated to the region who have a conservatism that really doesn't feel like his necessarily. It's maybe even more libertarian.
Right. One more question for you. Will trucking, and this is really, we're stretching your knowledge base here, Grant. So
I know.
will trucking get driverless trucks in the Pacific Northwest in the near future? I think invite others that might have insight into that too. But what do you guys see?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I do try to follow some of this technology as much as I can. I mean, this will make me sound like a geek, but PBS does a lot of stuff on this, like on the Nova specials and this kind of thing. So I try to follow it. The problem is that they've made a lot of progress on it, but they're really not there yet. And keep in mind, even if you get some technology that seems to work really well and it's maybe getting ready for market, you have a whole regulatory process you're going to have to go through. And so I do not see a near-term solution through driverless vehicles.
Yeah.
I mean, I just don't. I think we're going to be stuck with this. And remember, the trucking industry, like a lot of industries, has an aging labor force. They're struggling to get people into the jobs. And then on top of this, you've got the pandemic issues, which have complicated the industry. They're sort of in a tough position, but quite frankly, they're not the only ones. You have other industries. Healthcare is a good example. Regional healthcare, they're struggling with a lot of the same labor issues, and there's a limited amount of automation in the future for that. Right. But I would say trucking, the near-term answer is not going to be automation.
Great. Thank you, Grant. And just once again, the Northwest Gas Association thanks you as always for your insight and expertise in this space. We look forward to hearing from you again at our annual energy conference, which we'll be holding in Sun River, Oregon, June 8th and 9th this year. So be on the lookout for those of you on the webinar for the registration. Registration's not up for that yet, but you might save the dates. June 8th and 9th for our annual energy conference, where Grant will be one of our key presenters. So once again, look on our website for links to our upcoming webinars, which are both going to be excellent. And we appreciate your participation in today's webinar and look forward to seeing you again in a month, if not before. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.